Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. The valley always had a way of humbling you, especially after 3 days of solid rain. The river would swell, bleed over the low banks, and claw at the edges of fields like it was trying to remember the shape of its old floodplain. I'd seen trucks pulled from culverts and livestock swept clean off pasture land. But even then, I'd have said the river was the only thing that ever scared me around here. Not the folks who lived along it. Not the quiet types with strong backs and stronger opinions. That was before the world started tilting sideways, before the headlines dried up and the back-channel talk took their place. Back when morning still meant coffee on the back steps and the distant sound of cattle somewhere past the tree line. I worked maintenance for the county schools, electrical mostly, whatever kept the lights on, and the boilers working through winter. Lately, I'd been splitting my weeks between circuit panels and rewiring old gym lights, pretending not to notice how thin the orders were getting. I'd built a life out of being dependable, but I didn't depend on much. My way of thinking leaned simple. Don't count on rescue. Not from the government, not from neighbors, not even from God when the phone stopped ringing. My ex-wife used to say that was less a worldview and more a slow-motion suicide pact. Maybe she wasn't far off. Our son Eric lived with her up in Lexington, came down a couple weekends a month. Good kid, smarter than I'd been at his age, though he thought my prepper streak was funny. Not in a cruel way, just the way teenagers laugh when something smells like paranoia dressed up as hard work. I never tried to convert him. I just showed him the hand pump I'd bolted into the cement slab beside the barn. Walked him through how the manual intake valve worked on the cistern filter. I didn't say, when the grid collapses. I just said, if the lights go out for good, water's still worth more than anything in a safe. He nodded the way kids nod when they're humoring you, but he remembered it. I could tell. The property sat in a low patch of land a few miles southeast of Albany, Kentucky, along the outer bend of the Cumberland River. You'd think it was flat if you only glanced at it from the county road, but the topo map told the real story. A gentle dip that caught runoff like a bowl if the drainage ditches backed up. That dip was the reason I built the bunker 9 feet below the surface, under a pole barn, with rust-blushed siding and a sagging sliding door. Most people wouldn't give the place a second look. The bunker came together over 3 winters, one cement pour at a time. Cinder block walls reinforced with rebar. A poured concrete roof thick enough to park a truck on top. Inside the barn, the entry hatch sat under a warped sheet of plywood and an oil-stained rug that smelled like chainsaw fuel. I ran the air intake beneath a gravel bed to a mushroom cap vent hidden by weeds near the fence line. Rigged it with a manual overpressure valve and swapped in HEPA and charcoal filters salvaged from an old county health clinic before it closed. Power came from 24 solar panels mounted low to the ground and angled south. Batteries kept in thermal cases. I kept a diesel generator sealed and ready, treated the fuel like it was medicine, even had a crank for the emergency inverter in case the sky decided not to play nice. The food stock could last one man 5 years if rationed. Water tanks sat buried next to the structure, gravity-fed and triple-filtered. I kept the firearms basic, a 12-gauge for up-close decisions, a lever-action 30-30, and a bolt-action 22 for anything that required silence or patience. The bunker was built to be forgotten by the world above it, and I liked it that way. Lists kept the fear at bay. Tasks made it all feel like preparation, not obsession. But it didn't hit all at once. There were no sirens, no televised address. The signs came in fragments, like drops of water on concrete before the storm. A custodian in Somerset mentioned his nephew couldn't get into urgent care. Clinic had closed its doors 2 days early for flu season. A dispatcher friend in Berksville said her overnight calls had taken a strange tone. Too many reports of violent behavior, no follow-ups, no ambulance arrivals. I started scanning the ham bands again. Old habit, just to see if the folks in Ohio were talking. What I picked up wasn't chatter, it was friction. Nets started popping up on 7.160 megahertz, people trying to coordinate check-ins from Tennessee, Ohio, northern Indiana. Some spoke like this was a drill, Others weren't even pretending. A guy from Louisville swore up and down he watched military forklifts loading unmarked crates at night, under cover of civilian trucks. In Nashville, a nurse crackled over a bad signal that the ER was beyond capacity, patients restrained, symptoms unlike anything she'd seen. Most of it smelled like static and half-truths, but I didn't need the full picture. I saw the trend line. Supply chains were snapping. Authorities were changing scripts mid-sentence. The tone wasn't panic, but it wasn't far from it either. I started moving gear, topping off fuel, running test cycles on the generator. I told myself it was just a precaution, but my hands moved like they knew something I hadn't admitted yet. 2 weeks before the first official alert, I started moving more gear down to the bunker. The solar charged the battery pack fine, and the generator test ran smooth. The hand pump pulled clean water through the ceramic filters after 20 strokes. I checked desiccants in the food buckets and swapped out oxygen absorbers. I bolted a second bar across the inner hatch and rehearsed a full lockdown drill. I won't pretend this was casual. I muttered to myself while I worked, the same way I do when I wire a panel, talking through steps out loud so the mind doesn't skip the boring part. I set up the radios on a shelf, the HF rig, the VHF for local chatter, and the little portable for weather. I wrote down frequencies and times on a laminated card. Nets on 7.400 MHz at dusk. Weather from the Jamestown transmitter on the half hour. Old military bands I knew were quiet but worth checking. I called my son every evening. He hated the prep talk, so we talked baseball and his shop class project, a cedar box that didn't sit flat. I told him to plane the high corner and stop chasing perfect. When he asked why I sounded stern, I said work had been long. I said it would be nice to take him fishing once the water warmed. I did not tell him the line of trucks I'd watched at the little grocery in town, or the shelf where rice used to be. When the alert finally hit phones, it was clinical. Localized outbreaks, temporary restrictions, limit travel. In town, the pharmacy's gate was already down. The cashier at the hardware store said the owner was sick. A state truck rolled slow through the square with a loudspeaker, and that was the moment the air changed. I paid for a new pack of utility blades and 2 more propane cylinders and drove home without the radio on. I loaded the last crates into the barn, pulled the truck around back, and threaded it under a camo tarp in the hedgerow, just in case. Then I locked down, stepped onto the ladder, pulled the hatch shut, spun the wheel, and heard the world go quiet above me. Day 1 felt like a single long breath I forgot to let go. I know you asked for my voice in the present, and that's what this is. I'm describing it while I can still smell the solvent and the faint metal of the hatch handle in my hand. I laid down rules on the whiteboard by the workbench. Wake at 0600 hours, cycle the intake fans for 20 minutes, check battery levels, then the inverter, then the generator's fuel gauge. Breakfast, oats from a 5-gallon bucket, freeze-dried fruit. I spoke the rules out loud, not for company, but for clarity. There was a certain steadiness in hearing words echo off the concrete. The first week went to routines. I rationed power, kept the LED strips low, used a lantern when I could. I read labels when I moved cans because labels matter when months blur. I listened to the HF bands. Voices sounded farther away each night. On the weather radio, the NOAA loop played as if nothing in the world had shifted except barometric pressure. The loop said possible showers for Russell County and a mild ridge over Lake Cumberland. The loop did not say anything about what the ambulance sirens in Jamestown sounded like just before dawn. On the third night, I climbed up to the periscope and rotated the handle. The eyepiece showed the barn interior first, then the gap under the sliding door, moonlight pooling in a thin blade. Outside, the gravel drive was empty, fence line quiet, trees doing their usual whisper. Then movement. A figure on the road, not a neighbor. Clothes torn, one shoe missing, moving without a plan. I whispered, not a prayer, just a name I didn't know. I kept the whisper small and let the person pass. No heroism, no speech. I wrote a note to myself after, good fences on day 3, better fences by day 10. I won't call what I did bravery, it was maintenance. I adjusted settings, stacked lids tight, rotated out one bucket of rice to make sure none of the oxygen absorbers had failed, and I set out shallow pans with a sprinkle of flour by the storage shelves. In the morning, ant tracks thread into a hairline crack I hadn't noticed. I mixed epoxy and sealed it. Ants are like water. They find the gaps you think are too small to matter. Out loud I said, "If you can get in, so can everything else." It sounded dramatic, so I smiled at myself and kept working. The second week brought new voices on the radio. A man in Knoxville with a clear signal who ran a net twice daily, using a cadence that sounded like he'd been in uniform. A woman outside Bowling Green who checked in at dusk and sometimes cried between transmissions, but never once forgot to give her grid square. I waited for someone in Albany, Jamestown, Burkesville, Salina. Static ate those places, like the map itself had begun to fray where the river bent. On day 9, I heard the first real detail from anyone official. The Army Corps had stepped in at multiple dams across the region to control reservoirs, while crews were... The voice clicked out, then returned. Redeployed. The word redeployed does a lot of work when you don't want to say where. I traced the river with my finger on the laminated topo, from Wolf Creek Dam down past where the Cumberland loops toward the Tennessee line. I'd fished below the dam with my son once, in a cold fog that beaded on the reel. I pictured that same fog, and tried to picture it full of shambling bodies. I stopped that line of thought and wrote another line of rules. No imagining beyond what can be tested. If you're waiting for me to say the first infected wandered into my yard and forced a fight, it didn't go that way. Not at first. What forced me out of the comfortable circle of my routines was smaller. The water in the pre-filter slowed, which meant the intake from the cistern carried more silt than it should. I flushed it with a spare gallon and watched the cloud that came out. Dirt and something else. A film that clung to the housing. Surface water up top was being stirred. I pictured too many feet crossing the shallows by the fence line. I kept my picture small, and my voice steady and said, "We're going to change the cartridge 1 week early." We included me and the room. I know that sounds silly. When you live underground, you adjust pronouns to keep from arguing with the walls. On day 11, I went topside for the first time since the hatch closed. I did it at night while the moon was thin, wearing the old rubber boots I use for the garden and a camo jacket I don't otherwise admit to owning. I moved slow, the way you do when you step into a creek bed and don't want to turn an ankle on hidden rock. I checked the solar racks and brushed leaf litter off the panels with a soft broom so I wouldn't scratch the tempered glass. I topped off the generator diesel from a drum. The hedgerow hid the truck well. I could smell the river, a damp cool that turned a little sour if the wind shifted. I almost called my ex-wife then, as if the phone would somehow go through if I stood in the right patch of gravel and stared at the right star. I didn't call. I went back down. I locked the hatch and sat with my back to it for a minute, listening for anything that wasn't me. 2 nights later, I heard a voice outside. A man calling, not loud, but with that insistence that says he's trying not to bring attention while also asking for help. "Anyone here?" He stopped near the barn, and I could hear his boots on the gravel. He had a second voice with him, a woman. I kept the lights down and watched through the periscope. They looked like people who had gone too many days without sleep. The man carried a baseball bat. The woman had a backpack with one strap torn. They came to the barn door and tried it. Once, gentle. The man cupped his hands and put his face to the gap. "If you're there, we just need water." The woman touched his arm, like a person does when she doesn't want to say no, but needs him to move on. He stayed. "We'll leave something," he said. "We don't have much." I keep a speaker wired to a cheap handheld radio and a microphone on a long lead. I pressed the talk button and kept my tone level. "Keep moving," I said. "It isn't safe here." He jerked back, then stepped forward again. "We heard there's a man with a well." I didn't answer. The woman tugged his sleeve and they left. When they reached the end of the drive, 2 figures stepped out of the ditch, slow and wrong, the kind of wrong bodies get when joints don't map to minds anymore. The man raised the bat and did what he thought he had to do. The woman didn't swing. She whispered something I couldn't hear. After, they kept walking. I stayed at the eyepiece until they were gone. Then I turned the periscope to the tree line and studied the shadows there until dawn. I heard a shot on day 15. Not close, but not far either. A single crack followed by a useless burst. The kind of sequence that says fear took the trigger away from skill. By then, the radio nets had thinned. The Knoxville operator kept his schedule. The woman near Bowling Green had gone silent. Noah still looped the weather, because machines don't change tone when the world does. I started checking the core frequencies I had written down from an old list. Dead. I checked them again. On the third check, something keyed for half a second and let go. Day 17. Rain. It pushed a slow hiss through the gravel around the hatch. I ran fans at low speed to keep air sweet and prepared a little more than usual, just in case the river tested the drainage around the barn. The bunker's sump sat dry and clean. I told the concrete it was doing a good job. If you think talking to rooms is a sign of fray, you're not wrong, but it kept me honest about maintenance. Day 18 taught me something about noise. From underground, sound passes through earth like rumor. I could tell a truck from a four-wheeler by the vibration in the bolts of the ladder. A truck came and went at dawn. I waited until dusk to look, and when I did, there were new ruts in the lane and muddy prints near the hedgerow where the tarp on the truck had been tugged and settled back into place. I locked the inner safe on the gun cabinet and moved the lever action to a slot by the ladder in case I ever had to make a stand I didn't want to make. I rehearsed sightlines in my head and didn't like them. The barn is good cover until it isn't. At night, the moans started coming from the direction of the river. Not every night, not theatrical, just a sound like wind through wet reeds, and once a thump like a body hitting a fence post. I stopped moving around upstairs after dark. I kept my steps measured when I climbed to the periscope and made sure the stool never scraped the floor. The air had a new weight when I cracked the hatch to check the filters. I kept the cracks rare. On day 21, 2 UH-60s came over low. So low the rafters hummed. I killed the lights out of reflex and counted the rotor beats. The second bird sounded like it carried something heavy slung, the harmonics different. From the ridge beyond the river came a brief series of pops, controlled and spaced. Not small arms, date cord or charges set to test a structure. I pressed my palm to the concrete and told myself this was nearby but not immediate, like thunder you see far away. Day 22. I caught half a transmission on the HF rig. A voice with clipped diction read a statement about river operations. The words downstream hazard, infected concentrations, and controlled water release made it through the static. The rest turned to wool. I wrote what I heard on the whiteboard and circled it. The circle looked like a hole. I could feel my face go still the way it does when I take a test voltage and know it's higher than it should be. I kept the voice steady. We will verify before acting. Day 23, I risked the VHF on scan and got snippets from a law enforcement repeater that should have been quiet this far out. A man barking orders that were thin on people to carry them out. A request for barricades on a county road number I knew by heart. The river in my memory turned from a place to fish to a moving fence with teeth. I packed a small duffel without telling myself that's what I was doing. 2 pairs of wool socks, a lightweight tarp, a metal cup, the little alcohol stove and a fuel bottle, a roll of 10mm plastic sheeting, 50 feet of paracord, the first aid kit I keep separate from the big supplies. I added a map marked with a line to higher ground to the east, a ridge with an old fire tower whose steps had rotted out years ago. I knew the logging spur that led halfway there. The rest would be a scramble. Day 24. The rain returned, harder. The sump pit stayed dry. The intake filters darkened a shade faster. On the HF, at 1350 hours by my wristwatch, the clear voice from Knoxville cut out and another cut in. Not a net control, but a recording. "Attention all civilians in the Cumberland River Basin," it said, the words mechanical but not unfriendly. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers will initiate controlled demolition of Wolf Creek Dam at 0600 hours on the 31st day of containment. Objective: eliminate concentrated infected populations and prevent downstream spread. All persons downstream are instructed to reach higher ground no later than 2200 hours on the 30th day. The message repeated, then repeated again on a second frequency. When the recording ended, silence followed like a lid on a pot. I did not move for a full minute. I counted to 60, because that's easier than breathing on purpose. When I finished the count, I picked up the grease pencil and circled the date. I said the words out loud. 0600 hours, day 31. I pictured the lake behind the dam, miles of cold water stored under a sky nobody owned anymore. And I pictured all that water let loose as if you tipped a basin. I imagined the timing. 10 miles downstream, give or take. How fast water moves when it stops being a river and becomes a surge depends on the slope and the channel, and what sits in the channel. Houses, cars, the bodies of things that used to be people. I turned the imagined picture smaller and fixed it to the one choice that mattered. Stay and bet on concrete, or leave and bet on dark woods. Day 25. I went topside again to lay eyes on the slope from the barn to the tree line. The grass held water like a sponge. The air was still. I listened. In the distance, in the direction of the dam, there was a rolling thunder that wasn't weather. Maybe test shots in the earthen abutment. Maybe the power plant being prepared for what was coming. A pair of dogs crossed the far end of the property and froze when they caught my scent. One limped. The other's coat hung in patches, and I couldn't call it mange. I lowered my gaze so the dogs wouldn't see the focus change. They trotted on. I hated closing the hatch more than usual after that, but I closed it. I set a 48-hour plan. Cache 1, 2 5-gallon buckets sealed with gaskets, buried behind the second fence post east of the old apple tree, with rice, beans, a Sawyer filter, a small Bic lighter, and a copy of the topo map marked with routes. Cache 2, same, half a mile deeper into the trees along the logging spur, near a stump with lightning scars. I told the room each step while I packed the buckets, because saying the steps cut down on mistakes. I prepped the truck in the hedgerow, checked the oil, checked the coolant, tested the lights under the tarp so the glow wouldn't show. Then I wrote no truck on the whiteboard and circled it. The lane runs low. In a flood you drive a boat or you walk, and I don't own a boat. Day 26. A pair of men came by in the afternoon with rifles slung crosswise, and that look on their faces like a question had been chewing behind their eyes for too long. One wore a camo jacket with a church softball logo. The other wore a runner's windbreaker and shoes ruined by mud. They did not try the barn door. They stood in the lane and talked in voices meant to carry without seeming to. "He's down there," the camo jacket said. "He always was a little off." "Off is fine," the runner said. "Off has water." I put the microphone to my lips and said, "Move along." And then I paused, because sometimes tone matters more than words. And then I added, "This place is about to flood." The runner laughed once in a way that wasn't humor. The camo jacket looked toward the river and turned his face a little, as if he had felt that truth in his bones before I said it. They left. I listened until the sound of their steps blended with tree noise. That night I packed my personal kit. I added the cedar box my son had made, the one that didn't sit flat, because sometimes you carry weight that isn't strictly logical. I added a family photo printed on cheap paper. I left my favorite jacket hung on the hook because that's how you tell yourself you're coming back. I placed 2 index cards on the workbench, one with a list of what to grab in the last 10 minutes if time allowed, and one with a list of what to leave even if time allowed. The second list is harder. It keeps you honest. Day 27 was listening. Helicopters again. A burst of machine noise from the ridge toward Jamestown. The river's voice changed a little, a deeper undertone that might have been my imagination. I walked the bunker with a notebook and wrote down every small sound the place made, so I could tell if something new crept in. Drip at the laundry sink, hum at the inverter, tick at the power bar after it cycles. I wrote quiet next to the ones I wanted to keep. I wrote check next to the ones that felt wrong. I let the generator run 15 extra minutes to charge the batteries a little higher. Maybe that was superstition. Maybe it was prudence. I didn't argue with myself about it. Day 28. Someone tried the barn door hard enough that the padlock knocked against the hasp. I stood under the hatch with the lever action and talked to myself in a whisper you could mistake for prayer. The man outside swore softly, then heaved. The wood groaned. His partner said, "Leave it." And the first man said, "2 more." I climbed 3 rungs and put my eye to the crack under the hatch. A shape crossed the barn door window, then another shape, lower, hunched. The first man grunted like someone who'd taken a heavy bag to the ribs. The lower shape shambled into view. There was a scuffle. The barn door banged. The sound of a rifle butt hitting metal. The first man yelled once and then little. The partner ran. I did not open the hatch. I did not make a case for goodness at my own expense. I waited a long time, then longer still. When I went up at dawn and used the periscope, the door hung crooked, and the gravel showed tracks that didn't respect property lines at all. I fixed the door with lag screws and an extra bracket I'd fabricated just for the possibility of foolishness. I set a wire on the lower corner tied to a bell by the ladder, so I'd hear if anyone or anything worried it again. I told the barn it had done well, and patted the wood like you pat a shoulder. Talking to inanimate things is a habit I hope to unlearn, when quiet is no longer a form of wealth. Day 29, the Knoxville voice came back for a moment and said, "Downstream is not optional. Move." And then the word move stretched out and became static. The recording played again at noon and at dusk. 0600 hours on day 31. Evacuate no later than 2200 hours on the 30th. I cleaned my boots. That's how I told my body we were leaving, even though I didn't yet write it on the board. Dirt carries memory. Clean boots are a small kind of promise. I loaded cache 2 under the lightning scar stump and brushed leaves back over the disturbed dirt. On the way back, I saw a deer frozen mid-step on the far side of the fence, a wire tight around its foreleg. I stood there too long. I knew if I freed the deer, the noise could carry and bring company. I also knew I couldn't stand there and do nothing. I cut the wire with a pair of fencing pliers and stepped back while the deer flailed. It bolted in a line that wasn't straight. I picked up the cut piece of wire and coiled it. I don't know why I did that, except that leaving trash on the ground felt like surrender. By the time I closed the hatch that evening, the sky had gone the color of dirty tin. The river had a smell to it you only notice when you've lived near water your whole life, and something inside it has changed composition. I said out loud, "We go tonight," and that made it real. I pulled the index cards and checked the last-minute items. Small tool roll, headlamp, spare batteries, laminated list of frequencies, hand crank radio, wool cap, the cedar box, a pouch of letters folded to the size of a deck of cards. The leave list had hard words on it: generator, battery bank, long guns. The 12-gauge went into a cabinet with a lock I snapped shut like a sentence ending. I took the bolt action 22 and 10 rounds. The lever action 30-30 got 2 bandoliers. I wore one. The other sat by the ladder. I told myself I'd decide at the hatch. When darkness settled, I powered down everything but the refrigerator for an hour to let the batteries top off. I walked the room one last time. I put my palm on the concrete where my son had chalked his name one summer. The chalk not visible anymore, but still there in the way memories get ground into surfaces. I turned the intake to the setting that would hold air sweet if the hatch stayed closed for a month. I set the lamp on the workbench so if anyone ever found this room, the first thing he would see would be light and notes that someone had thought about him. I wrote on the whiteboard in block letters, "Go east, follow contour, do not cross low water after 2100. Then I drew an arrow to the laminated map and a line that hugged the ridge contour. I opened the hatch at 2100. The barn breathed in cooler night air. I let the ladder rungs take my weight slowly. I slid the hatch shut to the first catch and listened. The bell on the wire did not ring. Crickets did. The gravel felt like ball bearings under my boots. I moved to the side door of the barn and then out into the yard, staying close to the wall where the shadow was thicker. The bucket cache at the apple tree sat undisturbed. I took one handle in each hand and walked bent at the waist to lower the silhouette. In the lane, tire ruts had filled with a skin of water that picked up the thin moon. I listened south toward the river and north toward the ridge. South was a low rumble like trucks on a highway far away, except the highway had been empty for days. I made the tree line and slid into the brush where the logging spur begins. If you've ever walked those spurs at night, you know how they pretend to be roads until they stop pretending and turn into ditches, then into deer paths, then into the idea of a way forward. I moved quietly. Not because quiet would save me if a group waited up ahead, but because quiet made me choose each step, and that kept the mind clean. A branch snapped to my left and I stopped, lifted the rifle by the sling to keep it from catching, and breathed through my mouth so less moisture fogged in the cool air. It was a raccoon in the ditch with something limp in its jaws. The animal drew back into the low weeds and watched me pass with wet eyes. At the half-mile mark, I set the second cache where the stump showed its lightning scar, tamped the dirt, and brushed leaves carefully with the flat of my hand. When I stood, a splash sounded downslope where the spur crossed a shallow cut. Two figures came into view, not moving like men move, not even like drunk men move, but with that forward lean I had seen near the road. I dropped to a knee and let a low branch take most of my outline. The two drifted through the cut and kept going, drawn by something that wasn't me. I waited a full count of 60 again before moving. In the distance, a single engine coughed, tried to start, then died. When the cough stopped and the night settled, the quiet became full of breathing that wasn't mine. I told myself it was the woods, because the woods breathe, and then I told myself to stop narrating the world as if words were armor. The ridge rose slow. I kept my pace steady. I used the map more for comfort than need. The old fire tower sat east-northeast on a line you could keep if you knew how the valleys feed the bigger draws. Twice I cut away from the spur to avoid low ground where the rain had pooled. Once I heard voices and saw a dim campfire. Not orange bright, but a coal simmer under a pot. I could have walked in and put hands up and asked for company. I kept walking. Company makes promises no one can keep when dawn comes and water moves. At 2300, I reached the last draw before the ridge. It holds a trickle most summers, and now it held a sheet of brown water 6 inches deep and moving like a dog that wants to play but doesn't know the rules. I cut upstream and found a wide spot where stones showed and stepped from one to the next, using a branch as a staff. My boot slid once and went in, cold up to the ankle, but I kept balance. On the far side, I crouched and let the water run out and set the boot down and laced tighter. I glanced back. A figure stood on the near side, 20 yards downstream, head tilted, not running, not calling, listening, the way I had been listening for weeks. I don't know if he saw me. He turned away as if remembering a chore and walked along the bank. Midnight. The ridge rose steeper now, and the trees thinned enough that I could see the sky better, and the hint of the tower through dark branches like bones. I stayed off the crest by 30 yards, because straight lines make you visible. My breath felt loud to me, but I knew that was brain and not fact. I kept my steps measured. I spoke once, a whisper low enough that even I barely heard it. Left foot, right foot. It wasn't a mantra, it was a checklist. I reached the tower's clearing at 0100. The legs of the tower were still there, steel and rust, the stairs gone after the county cut them away a decade ago to keep teenagers from hurting themselves. The platform looked good enough to hold 2 men, maybe 3. I stood at the edge of the clearing and rotated slowly, listening. There was a small service building at the base, with a roof that had kept most weather out. I eased the door open and let the dark breathe on me. Dust, mouse droppings, old paper, a map case in the corner, a cot frame without a mattress. I set my pack inside and stepped back out to the clearing and looked west toward the valley. You can't see the river from there. Not really, but you can see where it must be by how the land sinks and how fog lays. The fog looked sewn to the earth. I ate a handful of trail mix by counting, because people eat faster when they don't count. I drank from the metal cup and let a mouthful sit a second, so my brain got the message that water was still real. In the service building, I found a ragged binder with a faded core logo on the cover, schedules no one uses anymore, a safety checklist fused by damp. I lay on the cot frame and put my boots on the pack so I wouldn't forget I planned to wear them. I set the alarm on the watch to 0530, then turned it off, because who sleeps before a thing like this? Around 02, the wind shifted. It brought a scent that did not belong in trees, a cold metal tang like water drawn deep. I walked back to the clearing and stood with the rifle on its sling and watched the west as if it might explain itself. Somewhere in the valley, a dog barked 3 times with an even rhythm. Somewhere else, a single shot, and then someone shouted a name. The name didn't carry. The voice did not call it again. I let the words settle. Then I stepped back into the service building and drew a line on the topo that marked the slope from my barn to the first rise. I put an X where I thought the water would make its first hard push. I underlined the X and told myself that guessing can be useful when you admit you're guessing. At 04, the recording came on again on the handheld, a little weaker but still clear. "Controlled demolition at 0600 hours, the voice said. "Downstream hazard." I imagined the engineers standing on the dam in the dark, their faces lit by headlamps, fingers on detonator caps, men and women who never thought their job would look like this. I imagined someone thinking about the fish, because that is how humans are. I imagined someone thinking about a house that would go, a house with a red truck in the drive and a mailbox shaped like a bus, because that is how humans are too. I told myself to stop imagining strangers into people I could mourn. I failed, and did it anyway. 05. The sky went from black to a grey that felt like a held breath. The owls stopped. The smaller birds, the ones that manage on scraps, started. I checked my pack one more time and put the cedar box under my jacket where it would stay warm against my side. I took the second bandolier and looped it over my shoulder. I checked the chamber on the lever action. I said, "We do not fire unless the math says firing is the only way the next step happens." And it sounded overcomplicated, but right. 05:30. The valley looked like a sketch the world was bored of finishing. I stood at the tree line and watched the place where my barn should be, a small, dark rectangle. I couldn't see it. The fog did the work of mercy and hid it. The wind came over my right shoulder and brought a sound like trucks again, but trucks that went on and did not shift gears or slow for hills. The sound grew. It wasn't a roar. It was a pull, the sound the world makes when it changes shape. 05:50. A line of birds rose from the valley in a ragged line, the way fish scatter when a boat passes over them. The sound deepened. Somewhere behind me, in the brush, something moved and stopped. I did not turn to look. I let the rifle stay at rest on its sling and kept my eyes on the west. The air felt like it leaned. I know I said I wouldn't talk about feelings like they were the point. I'm telling you the facts. Leaves rattled as if a low wind had pushed through, except the treetops didn't sway. The ground under my boots hummed a fraction, not enough to knock anything loose on a shelf, enough to make you check the shelf. 05:58. The sound took on edges. You could pick pieces out of it now. The drag of water over rock, the snap of something big snapping again. The fog at the valley floor moved as one piece, not fast, but with intent, like a blanket being pulled by a careful hand. I looked for the barn and didn't try to look too hard. The mind protects itself when it knows a thing can't be changed. 0600 hours. It did not begin with a bang you'd write in a book. It began like a mountain swallowing. The fog lifted, rolled, and then the valley filled with a color that wasn't the river's usual brown. It was lighter, full of air, full of torn things. The sound at that moment turned into something that made human talk pointless, so I didn't try to talk over it. I let it happen. I thought of the whiteboard in the bunker, and the arrow pointing east, and the way my son wrote his name in chalk, where the concrete would keep it safe longer than paper. I thought of the cedar box under my jacket and the weight of it against my ribs. I watched the first line of water hit the low pastures and climb the fence posts and turn the fence posts into drift lines. When the initial surge passed, the water kept coming, not as high, but relentless. It folded into drawers and filled them, climbed hedgerows and ate them, found the lane and made it a stream. Trees on the far side of the valley leaned like men stepping aside for a crowd, and then stopped leaning and lay down. I could not see the barn. I could see where it would be, a bruise under the moving skin of the valley. The power of it was not in the height. It was in the distance it claimed in minutes that used to belong to people's daily lives. I stood there long enough for the sound to become part of the morning, and then stepped back into the service building and put the rifle across my knees and stared at the map. I drew a new line, not back to the barn, but along the ridge toward a cut I knew that ran to a county road that ran to higher ground, and possibly to a farmhouse whose chimney I could see in my memory from a winter hike. I said the farmhouse's name, not because I knew it, but because every place has a name, even if we don't say it out loud. Then I said, "We keep moving," and that became the whole plan. I waited until the surge settled into the steady push that rivers have when patience is the only verb they know. I checked the tower legs for any signs of stress from the ground's hum. I wrote a note on the back of the core binder with my call sign and the date and a simple map, left it on the cot frame where a person might look first. I shouldered the pack. I adjusted the bandolier. I took one last look west without trying to pick the barn out of that new temporary lake. Sometimes you don't need to see the exact spot where you lose something to know exactly where it was. I stepped into the trees and angled southeast, keeping to the contour line that would carry me toward that farmhouse and maybe a dry loft with hay left in it. The first half-mile was easy. My legs warmed. My breathing found a rhythm. I crossed a shallow place where water seeped and didn't think about what that water had carried an hour ago. In a low stretch of pine, I heard someone up ahead. A single person moving without trying to hide it. I stopped, put the rifle butt on my hip, and waited for the figure to show himself. He came around the curve with his hands open and empty. A boy really, maybe 19. A Kentucky Wildcats cap, sweat dark and too tight on his head. He saw me and froze, and then held his hands higher to show he meant no harm. "Sir," he said, and the word sir had a tremor like he wasn't used to saying it. "Are you heading up or down?" "Up," I said. "I lost my people," he said. "My dad said go high if I got split. He meant high like a porch, but I figure a ridge is better." "We can walk a spell," I said. "No promises." He nodded, face doing that thing a face does when it doesn't know whether to show relief or keep all the doors closed. We walked. He told me his name was Casey. He told me he'd been at the campground by the lake when the first mess began, and he thought the rangers had things handled until the rangers went away. He told me his dad had stayed behind at a bait shop because someone needed to watch the cache. He told me this without looking at me, like he needed to get the lines out or they would tangle inside him. I told him my name and nothing else, because the rest would come if it needed to. We reached a place where the trail narrowed, and a small log spanned a muddy cut. Casey stepped onto the log, wobbled, caught himself. I put a hand out without touching him. On the far side, he turned to say something, and his face changed. I heard it a second later. Voices behind us. Not words, just the rhythm of people who had decided to move together. I kept my voice low. "We keep going," I said. "No curiosity." He nodded. We cut off the trail into a patch of laurel and moved, bending branches ahead of our faces with palms open so the leaves would swing back slow and quiet. The voices went by on the trail, 3 men by the sound. One heavy, one light, one with a cough he tried to swallow. They carried metal that clicked and leather that creaked. They did not speak names. One paused and said, "Water took the low road," as if narrating the obvious for someone far behind. Then they pressed on. Casey mouthed the word wow like a question. I shook my head. We waited a 2 count of 60 and then moved again. By noon, the sky brightened and turned the wet bark of the trees into mirrors. We could hear the river from everywhere, a steady talk that had replaced the birds for the day. We stopped once to drink in a shallow draw. I set the Sawyer filter and let the water run through slowly, careful with the bottles, careful with the lids. Casey stared at it like magic. I showed him how to backflush and how to cap the clean side after you touch the dirty water. He nodded as if I were telling him about a rite of passage. We reached a short fence line with barbed wire that had seen better days and climbed through using a pair of sticks to lift the line. On the far side, the land opened into a pasture rising toward a stand of oaks. In the middle of the pasture stood a horse that didn't belong to any fence anymore. It trotted, stopped, snorted and trotted again. When it saw us, it lifted its head and took 3 careful steps our way. Casey put a hand out. The horse stopped. Some animals know how to ask questions without words. We didn't answer that one. We kept moving. By mid-afternoon, we could see the farmhouse chimney, a black striation against the grey sky. The house sat on a knob like someone set it there after checking a chart for flood lines. A stand of cedar trees flanked it. No smoke, no movement. The front door hung open enough to show darkness inside. I held up a hand, and we paused at the bottom of the slope and listened for a sound that would tell us to turn around. Nothing. We went up. At the porch, I asked Casey to stay to the right of the door and watch the fields while I peered in. The front room looked like a dozen farm front rooms, a sofa with a crocheted throw, a television that had been a friend once, a coffee table with 3 circular stains from mugs. The air had that still photo quality. I stepped inside and moved through with the rifle at low ready. The kitchen was clean in a way that people leave houses clean when they mean to come back. Pantry held jars of beans and beets, 2 sacks of flour rolled tight and tied with string. In the back bedroom, a quilt folded at the foot of the bed. In the closet, a pair of muddy boots and a coat with a set of keys in the pocket. I didn't touch the keys. We set up in the loft, which smelled like hay and old summers. I opened a little window on the west side. Through it, the valley showed a line of water that caught sun where clouds thinned, a lake where pasture had been. I took the handheld and tuned the weather. The NOAA voice reported water levels with a precision that felt like a kindness. The core recording played once at the top of the hour, then stopped. Someone somewhere decided to let the echo fade. Casey lay on his back and stared at the rafters. "You had a place," he said, not looking at me. "A bunker." "Yes," I said. "You left it." "Yes." "Why?" "Because the valley doesn't care about how much you stored," I said. "Because sometimes leaving is the only way to not become a line of debris on a fence." He nodded like he understood part of that, and would spend a year understanding the rest. He rolled on his side. "You think my dad made it?" "I don't know," I said. "But we're higher now than we were this morning. That's the first rule right now. Higher ground and clean water and quiet." Evening lowered itself over the knob. We ate from a can with half the care of ceremony. I showed Casey how to use the alcohol stove on the loft's wooden floor without setting the place on fire. A trick taught by a scoutmaster who never trusted guerrilla confidence. We spoke little. Words had done their work for the day. Before dark, I walked the perimeter and found a spring house 20 yards downslope. The lid heavy but manageable. Cold water sang in a stone basin, and my hands didn't need to tell my brain that clean was possible. I filled 2 bottles and walked back slow so I wouldn't spill a drop. In the last light, 3 figures crossed the far end of the pasture. They paused where the ground turned damp and lifted heads the way deer do. They weren't deer. Casey sat up so fast he bumped the loft beam and winced. "Quiet," I said, and pointed 2 fingers to my eyes and then to the field. The figures turned away. 2 stumbled. One kept a line that almost looked like a route remembered. The horse in the middle of the pasture watched them without moving a step. Dark came soft. We set watches without pretending we were soldiers. I took the first 2 hours and used them to let my brain list everything that had changed since dawn. It was a long list. Somewhere near the top of it, the sound of the river had become the new baseline for the world's volume. Somewhere near the bottom, the cedar box rode against my ribs, and I had stopped feeling its edges. That's how weight lies when it decides to be carried for a while. Sometime after midnight, clouds broke, and a sliver of moon turned the fields into geometry. A fox trotted the fence line with the confidence of small predators on big nights. I dozed, woke, and then the watch changed, and Casey sat with his back to the loft post and his chin tucked into his collar, and stayed vigilant the way boys do when the thought of failing feels like a test they refuse to take. Morning brought a quiet that felt earned. The river still spoke, but from farther down in the throat. We ate oatmeal with a pinch of sugar I found in a mason jar with a paper label marked Thanksgiving. We cleaned the pot the way you clean things when you live with them. We checked the yard and the fence and the spring house again. I tuned the HF and got a voice out of Knoxville that sounded tired and careful. He reported water levels, and then he said, "If you can hear me and you're alive on high ground, establish. Do not descend for at least 48 hours unless rescue is certain, and the ground between is tested." He said it once, then said it again. and then asked for check-ins. I did not check in. Some days you hold what you know close. By noon, we had a plan made of small steps. We would hold the farmhouse for 2 days. We would inventory what the pantry had and what we could add from our packs. We would set a simple alarm on the south fence with a pie pan and a string so anything big enough to step through made a noise a man can wake to. We would not shoot unless math demanded it. We would move the first cache from the stump to a spot near the cedar clump. We would look for the ladder remnants at the fire tower when we had to go back that way, because a platform in the sky is sometimes better than walls when water decides to turn roads into cousins of rivers. Casey found a Bible on the mantle with a ribbon marking a birth, a marriage, and a death. He didn't read from it. He opened and closed it the way a person opens and closes a door to see if hinges still hold. He set it back exactly where it had been. Some kindnesses are small and cost nothing. Late afternoon, a man walked up the lane with a towel tied to a stick like a flag he didn't want to interpret. He stopped 20 yards from the porch and raised the towel shoulder height. He looked like a farmer in church clothes from too many Sundays ago. Pants stiff with mud, shirt buttoned wrong at the top. He wore a hat with a feed store logo and held it together with the kind of dignity men use when they don't want to scatter what's left inside them. "I'm not going to the door," he said. "I'm going to set this down and back up. Inside is a note and a map that might help you help me." He laid the towel down and stepped back 5 paces. He kept his eyes on the porch. I moved to the edge where he could see my hands open and empty. "All right," I said. "You can go." He nodded once and did not turn his back on the porch until he reached the bend in the lane. The towel held a ziplock with a pencil note and a hand-drawn map of the next ridge. The note said, "My wife is in a car on the low road. Water is around her up to the doors. She is not sick. If you have a boat, we can get her. If you don't have a boat, maybe you know where one is. I have a line and a set of pulleys. I am not asking you to risk. I am asking you to tell me if I am crazy." The map had a star that marked the bend where the road dipped. The pulleys were enclosed in a second bag. The handwriting belonged to a man who did careful work for a living. "Do we help him?" Casey asked. "Not with what we don't have," I said. "We don't have a boat." I looked out toward the valley. I pictured the low road with water pushing across it, and a car that had become an island with one person on it. I pictured the man walking up the lane with dignity and a towel. "We can walk to the crest and look," I said. "We can tell him what we see. We can share the math. That's something." We did. We met him at the bend and climbed to a spot where the trees parted and the low road showed itself as a brown line that disappeared under a sheet of water like glass with bubbles in it. A car sat in the place the map said it would, a sedan with the hood just out of the water and the trunk higher. A woman sat inside with her hands on the wheel, as if holding it still made the car a car. I raised the binoculars and lowered them. "She's alive," I said, "but the water is rising, and the current is fast near the middle." "I have the pulleys," he said, and his voice broke for the first time. "My boat is a mile west on the other road, lodged in brush. It was on the trailer when this happened." "We can try to get the boat," I said. "We will not drag anyone into the water. If we can't free it without putting a man in the current, we step back, you hear me?" He nodded. He heard, but hearing and believing are separate. I looked at Casey. "You stay," I said. "If we aren't back by dusk, you lock the door." We followed the man west along the ridge and down into a red clay cut where the other road used to be. The boat sat 10 feet off the road in scrub, a small aluminum john boat with a dented bow and a rope tangled around a half-buried stump. The water licked at the edge of the brush like a dog finding a scent. We tied the pulleys to a cedar trunk and the boat's stern handle. We hauled soft, then harder, the way you lift a person with dignity. The boat groaned and moved an inch. The man's jaw worked and he took the rope and heaved, and the boat came free with a squeal like a bad break. We dragged it to the road and set it in the shallow ditch water. I looked at the current and pictured the line from here to the car and said the math aloud. We anchor there, and we use the pulleys to edge in. We do not go in without a line. If the line snaps, we step back. He nodded again. Nodding is the only verb a man has left when the other verbs are heavier than he can carry. We worked slow. The boat nosed into the current like a stubborn animal. The line held. We moved hand over hand, and each foot of progress felt like more distance than it was. At the bend, the current grabbed harder. The boat slewed. The man grunted and brought it back. The car's rear window was down a hand's width. The woman's face appeared there, eyes wide. She shook her head fiercely as if saying no to something we hadn't offered yet. I realized she wasn't shaking it at rescue. She was shaking it at the idea of leaving the island that had kept her dry so far. I spoke, not shouting, but with the tone I used when I told my son not to put his hand near the saw. "Mom," I said, "we have a line. We will put it on the car and we will put a second on you. You will stay with the car until we say move. We do not argue with water." Her eyes found the man's face and softened. She nodded once. We clipped the line to the rear frame under the bumper and fed a second to the window. The man spoke to her then, words the river ate, and I watched his throat work. He put the second line around her waist like a seatbelt. We backed the boat to the edge of the current and held. The water rose a fraction on the hood. We moved her slow. When the line came taut, she stopped, breathed, and moved again. When her feet touched the boat, it dipped and the current tried to pivot it. I leaned in, and the man leaned in, and our shoulders knocked. We kept our minds on the next foot and nothing else. The bow swung and the stern fetched up against the line. We held. The boat found a new balance. We edged back along the pulleys. When the boat's hull scraped gravel, the man made a sound that had more gratitude in it than any word. On the road, the woman stared at us and said, "I thought you wouldn't see me." The man said, "I saw you," and put his hands on her shoulders without shaking her, because sometimes shaking joy into a person is the wrong move. I said, "We go now," because the river does not keep small promises, and they nodded like students excused after the bell. We walked back toward the farmhouse in a line, the way soldiers do without meaning to. At the bend where we had first looked down at the car, I stopped and let them walk ahead. The river's surface bucked where the car had been. The world had erased it without a second thought. I watched the place for a count of 60, and then turned to follow the couple up the lane. At the porch, Casey stood with his hands open, and that look that says he had imagined 20 outcomes, and didn't dare ask which one happened. The woman sat on the step and lowered her head in her hands, and not to cry, but to breathe in a way that counted each minute as if it held a coin. The man put his hand on her back and looked at me with a nod that a person uses when he cannot write a letter big enough to hold what he wants to say. We gave them water and one of the flour sacks and a jar of beans, and pointed them toward a dry road that ran the spine of the ridge. We did not invite them to stay because numbers make noise, and noise gets tall. They did not ask to stay because the kind of dignity that ties a towel to a stick does not ask for a house when the world is short on houses. When they left, the porch felt larger and smaller at the same time. Night came, and the river's tone changed again, a lower pitch that told a man who had lived his life near water that the first slap had become a long pull. The Noah loop caught up and said what anyone with ears already knew. Downstream gauges had spiked and were now trending to a plateau. The recording about 0600 hours did not play. The engineers had done the thing you do when you run out of options and then turn to the next task. Count. I lay on the loft and watched moonlight trace lines on the rafters and thought about the whiteboard in the room under the barn and the words "Go East" that might still be sharp in the lamplight if the lamp still burned. I pictured my son's cedar box in my pack and knew he'd made it on a bench that wobbled but didn't collapse. I made a promise then, not out loud, because some promises work better when they stay in bone. The promise was this: I'd keep moving when the map said move and hold when the math said hold. I'd say no when no was the only safe word, and yes when a small yes could keep someone from becoming a line of debris on a fence. I'd speak to rooms less and to people more if the chance came right. By the time the sun crested the ridge, the fog had pulled back into the low pockets of the valley, exposing the debris fields it left behind. Flood-washed trees, overturned fencing, hunks of unidentifiable plastic and wood clinging to what used to be pasture. From the loft window, you could see the glint of the water still pooled deep across the floodplain. The surface shimmered like broken glass under a calm breeze. Somewhere under that slow-moving lake sat my bunker, the steel hatch sealed, the lights long since gone dark. Casey rolled upright on the cot, rubbed grit from his eyes, and stretched with a quiet groan. He looked at me the way people do when they're not sure whether it's morning or just the next segment of a very long night. "What do we do now?" he asked, voice low but steadier than it had been. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I shifted toward the window and watched a crow land on the barn's metal roof below, shake out its feathers, and hop twice before disappearing behind the peak. Then I said, "We take stock, count everything again. What's left, what we've used, what might spoil if the weather turns. We start mapping. The ridge to the north looks solid. Might be a repeater tower or an old fire lookout. If it's got elevation, it's got value. We'll check the airwaves at the top of every hour. Listen more than we speak. Mirrors during daylight if the sun's right." He nodded slowly, standing and twisting his shoulders as if shaking out the last of the sleep. "And the bunker?" he asked after a moment. I met his eyes. "It's gone, or buried deep enough to pretend it is. Doesn't matter. It bought us time, and that was its job." I didn't linger on the thought. We both knew the river had taken plenty more than just supplies and a bolted door in the ground. It had taken a certainty that once felt solid. We stepped out onto the porch. The morning air had that soaked earth smell, still tinged with something metallic and wrong. Down below, the water was already dropping, revealing patches of mud that would soon crust over and crack. The cedar trees beyond the fence swayed in a slow, lazy rhythm, as if reminding everything still standing that wind was still wind, and gravity still held. I looked across the valley and pointed a finger through the air, not at anything in particular, just tracing the faint stain left on a distant tree trunk where the high water had peaked. "There," I said. "That's the mark they'll talk about next spring. That's how far it came. And that's how far we're not going back." Casey didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We both understood that the days ahead weren't going to be defined by what we'd lost, but by the silence that came after, and what we were willing to do to fill it. We swept the porch, not because it needed it, but because it gave our hands something to do while our thoughts settled. Dust and leaf fragments scraped into a pile. I felt the old rhythm return. Push, draw back, repeat. A small kind of order, maybe pointless, but real. Casey watched me, then grinned faintly. "You always sweep at the end of the world?" I shrugged, letting the broom rest against the railing. "When I can," I said. "It's good to remind the world it still listens to small things." We stood there for a while, eyes scanning the horizon. The light changed minute by minute, brighter, harsher, cleaner. Below us, the road remained broken, cut in places by water, in others by the choices people had made. I didn't know who else was out there. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew the ridge was solid beneath my boots, and the farmhouse behind us hadn't collapsed. That was enough to start from.